He couldn't have put it in starker terms. According to Sanusi Lamido Sanusi, the former governor of the Nigerian Central Bank and former Emir of Kano, the state oil company, the NNPC, is the most opaque oil company in the world, one that is rarely subjected to proper forensic audits. Speaking at the Bank Directors Summit, which took place in Abuja on Thursday, Mr. Sanusi ramped up the rhetoric, warning about the dangers that the lack of a proper audit of the NNPC portends for Nigeria, as well as the unacceptability of the president doubling as the petroleum minister. And he talked about the level of public trust in the banking sector, which he said was at an all-time deficit and was falling off a cliff, to paraphrase him. He also stressed the absolute importance of keeping the central bank free of political influence. We'll have analysis of all that in a moment, but first, here's a flavor of what Mr. Sanusi had to say.
And we cannot afford to continue producing the oil and not seeing the revenue. We are no longer paying subsidies. So where are the dollars? Before it was under recovery. Now we don't have under recovery. Where is the money? It was the issue I raised for which I was suspended. You can suspend me again. Okay? But it is an issue that this country must address. NNPC is the most opaque oil company in the world. When I was in the central bank for 15 years, they had not been audited. We paid 11 trillion naira in fuel subsidy. There's no accountability up to now. The National Assembly called NNPC to bring the documents. They refused. And by the way, let me advise that this idea of the president being petroleum minister is not a good idea. The last president was minister of petroleum for 8 years. When I was governor of Central Bank, we had a petroleum minister. So when I talked about NNPC, I could attack Dizani. Now nobody can talk about petroleum because 8 years, if you talk, you're attacking the president. We need that buffer. Somebody has to be there. So a minister has to be there who is held accountable by Nigerians.
Sanusi Lamido Sanusi there. Well, for their assessment of the impact and import of Mr. Sanusi's speech, I'm joined now by a crop of top-level commentators. They are the current affairs analyst and professor of communications at Baze University in Abuja, Professor Abiodun Adeniyi, who is in our off-site studio, the journalist, political affairs commentator, and Arise News analyst, Dr. Constant Ikokwu, who is with me here in our main studio, and of course also with me the policy strategist, political commentator, and group CEO of the global investment and trade company Baba Yusuf. Lady and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And since you're the one who is marooned in the boonies of sort of by way of our off-site studio, Prof, let me start with you. And let's start with that declarative statement from Mr. Sanusi in which he stated in unequivocal terms that the NNPC is the most opaque oil company in the world. What's your reaction to that? Because I understand that the first audited accounts of the NNPC in decades were released just in 2020.
Yeah, Charles, thanks for having me. I think Emir Sanusi is just sounding typically a very critically minded person, somebody who is trenchant, a person you can describe as one conscious, of governance, as the case could be, always very forthcoming and exhaustive, helping us to highlight areas where we're probably still lacking in terms of accountability. And do not forget, we've made this argument severally, and it bears repeating. One of the bane of our government and governance system is the absence of transparency, the lack of accountability, the fact that there are leakages, there are wastages. And of course, when we're talking about NNPC, we know the role they play, a mainstay considering the fact that we are a monocultural economy. And of course, when we have that mainstay lacking, falling apart in the ability to come clean in terms of revenue, and then of course we're probably being shortchanged, in manners we probably cannot imagine. Yes, I also want to reckon that quite a number of other commentators have alluded to the point that the emir raised, but it's also good that we're having a voice like him, a personality like him, going further to highlight it, especially on a very important occasion where we have government officials, top bankers in place. And I want to believe as well that the president will be all ears. Yes, valid observation, no doubt. We had a situation where subsidy was removed, and there were reasons over the years why the subsidy needed to be removed. We are a nation where we are still deficient in infrastructure, and arguments have been made, reasonable arguments that is, that we probably need about 3 trillion, to meet our deficiency in infrastructure. A nation that is in this kind of need is not a nation that should not go the way of transparency. And of course, we're also aware of government's effort to ramp up revenue, ramping up revenue by including expertise or more, ramping up revenue by seeing the mileage that they can make in the mining sector, in the steel development sector, in the agricultural sector, contributing the volatility in oil. And of course, against that background of trying to raise revenue, do not forget also the question of consistent, persistent borrowing, possibly, probably. And of course, this is continuing. And against that background, you also be expecting that will be very prudent, will be very accountable in terms of the resources that we are still managing to generate. Oil subsidy removal, we all accepted it somehow as a fait accompli. And after that, you will expect there will be increased openness, so that we can have quality, we can have, service delivery, improved provision of goods and services, improved provision, or sufficient pointers, to the fact that the much needed infrastructure is going to be delivered, as the case could be. So if we are not seeing those signs, I think it's just okay for us to have a voice like that of the emir, coming at the level of intervention. And of course, the criticism is obviously constructive. It's just, a very polite, decent one, obviously so. And what the government probably need to do is just take it in good faith and see what they can do, to get our agency to be much more responsive at the level of openness. And of course, to the other one, regarding government holding on to the president holding on to the position of oil minister, it's been a practice over the years, and several reasons have been canvassed for this.
Well, we'll come to that in a minute. I don't mean to interrupt you, Prof. Okay. We're going to come to that in a minute. I just wanted to get through this first bit first. So just bear with us. We'll come to you in a minute, and I'll come to you, Dr. Constance Ikokwu, in a minute. But let me go to Baba Yusuf, because apart from the fact that when people like Sanusi speak, everyone listens, but it's also the fact that he draws attention, doesn't he, to just how alarming the state of affairs is. For instance, you remove subsidy, but nobody is seeing the money, and the budget is still being funded by borrowing. And Mr. Sanusi seems to trace it all back to the fact that nobody really has a handle on this country's oil revenues, not the Ministry of Finance, and perhaps not even the NNPC itself. I mean, what's your assessment of the impact of all this?
Thank you, Doctor. His Highness just, sorry, thank you, Charles.
My name's not Sanusi, so you don't need to use your Highness bit.
His Highness actually reiterated what almost every Nigerian knows. But what he did is to further engross the seriousness of this issue, speaking truth to power the way he did. And it is true. I totally agree that it is the most opaque, oil company in the world. Aramco of Saudi, Charles, is a Saudi Arabia entity, a monarchical system where we expect this kind of opaqueness or more. almost everybody can say a lot about the numbers and the goings-on of Aramco. But here we are running a democracy, having returned from military dictatorship in the past 23 years. But it appears it is going gloomer and darker than before. So it is an issue that Nigerians are very serious about. I hope I will see more seriousness on part of government, because this is our resources. They campaigned and took mantle of leadership and promised to run a government that is transparent. So the transparency is a sine qua non for the delivery of good governance. Unless that is done, the NNPC will continue to face these bashes from a lot of us, and the numbers can only increase until those doors and those lockers are opened for us to see how our resources are coming in, how our revenues are coming in, and how they are shared, in the tiers of government.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. And let me come to you, Dr. Constance Ikokwu. Thank you for your patience. And are you concerned and perhaps alarmed by the fact that for some inexplicable reason the NNPC doesn't seem to be properly audited, and the National Assembly, which has oversight powers, never quite seems to get underneath the skin of the NNPC?
Well, Charles, it is certainly worrying or disturbing to many Nigerians. When you look at the country, former Emir Sanusi is saying something that everyone is aware of. A country or a government that sets up and sustains opaque financial dealings in governance is intentionally or unintentionally condoning criminals and criminal activities. There's no question about that. If you want to have a system that is transparent, then you need to open the book. It's simple, it's ABC. You have to embrace technology. And when you do that, it's easier for everyone to see that you're a government that is working towards making sure that the people are involved and understand what is going on in government. He mentioned so many things such as auditing and metering. He said that metering has been an issue for 10 years. I think it's more than 10 years. Even under the former president, Olusegun Obasanjo, they were talking about metering. I remember the EFCC at the time was talking about the oil theft and how to arrest that sad situation. And it looks like vested interests in the country will at every turn try to torpedo any attempt at making sure that the system and the financial system is open and transparent enough. So I think that at this point in time, I hope that the president and his team are listening. They're talking about Nigeria being almost broke and not having enough revenue. So one of the ways that you can tackle this is to say, hey, we can stop it by metering. It's not difficult or it's not complicated, making sure that we embrace technology. And so you're documenting things properly. And then you also talked about auditing. Yes, auditing, I think it promotes trust and confidence for investors and stakeholders in the industry. It also promotes financial accuracy. You want to know what you're doing actually, So when this is all put together and you do it as a government, I think people will be delighted to say, yes, this government means business.
Absolutely, and of course auditing, hugely important for Nigeria as well, because we've got to keep a check on how the monies of this country is being spent. And Prof, let me come to you. I apologize for interrupting you earlier, but I needed to leave that discussion for another section. So let's pick up from what you were saying then. What about the idea of the president being the Minister of Petroleum? Do you think that is perhaps part of the reason why the NNPC appears to be so incredibly and almost unapproachably opaque?
Okay, first, Charles, I think before we get to that question, we'll probably have to also look at the way the other arms of government regard the NNPC. NNPC is ordinarily regarded, of course we know that it is in charge of our mainstay, and because of that they have earned themselves an unconscious regard, as an agency to be feared. There are other agencies of government that can actually call NNPC to account. Other agencies are actually empowered to question them. First of all, to what extent are those agencies making those efforts? And if they have made efforts in the past, like I'm aware through the media, I'm also aware that NNPC has been very, very reluctant to attend to those agencies. Again, you'll find those agencies being unable to continue their course or to bring up a case, maybe at a higher quarters against NNPC. So it's just regarded as a behemoth, an agency that cannot be challenged, and they have come to enjoy that status, and of course wrongly, which is again affecting us now, leading to the critical intervention of Emir Sanusi. So having said that, again, is the other part of whether or not the president should continue as oil minister. There are so many reasons that this has been happening over the years. We know if an NNPC GMD can look like an all-powerful, chief executive, for instance, how much more do we expect a minister to look like? Of course, we expect the ministers to probably look like a god. And I've had instances and commentaries pointing to the fact that whoever emerges, or those who have emerged as oil minister in the past, have become almost like a prime minister, like the vice president, or even much more powerful than what a vice president should be perceived as. So it's probably against that background that presidents in the past have come in thinking that they should rather assume that role. But the danger now, as is becoming obvious, is that because of the added weight they are putting upon themselves, imagine governing a huge country like Nigeria with all the complications as president and putting another weight on yourself as oil minister. Of course, at the end of the day, it's going to affect productivity and efficiency, and of course, eventually rub off on service delivery. That's what I think is the issue here. The presidents combining that role or appropriating that role, haven't been rewarding as we've seen in the past. So it's against that background that we can actually toe the path or the line of Emir Sanusi. That probably the president should probably think of shedding that weight to inject some level of productivity, higher level of productivity and efficiency into that sector against the background of the new status, of the organization as a limited liability company, as the case could be.
Well, yes, that's a very interesting analysis. And I think particularly in the context of what you were saying about the NNPC seeming to be above reproach, or at least above being sort of checked by other authorized organizations, you would have thought that in those circumstances, the president, because he's the petroleum minister, would be able to exert that kind of influence and bring the NNPC to heel. And Baba Yusuf, in terms of the history that Prof was talking about there, I think Obasanjo was petroleum minister, Yaradua was also petroleum minister, then later Buhari and Tinubu, but the person who broke that chain was Jonathan, who made Diezani Alison Madueke petroleum minister. Did that make a difference in terms of the NNPC being more accountable or less so?
Thank you, Charles. Two answers to one question. First of all, I'll answer the last question first. That is, there has been no difference. I mean, we knew what happened at that time. His Highness, His Royal Highness Sanusi was CBN minister. We had Diezani. We knew what happened. Fast forward to today. I think, first of all, the position of the petroleum minister being handled by Mr. President is part of the reason, is the key reason why we are where we are today with regards to the goings on in NNPC, Charles. First of all, from a good governance perspective, from a transparency and accountability perspective, the president, by holding that position, even from a constitutional perspective, I beg to be corrected, the president is probating and reprobating. So that is anti-good governance ab initio. Secondly, from a strategic perspective, if you look at value chains, whether public sector or private sector, in any entity, there are three critical creations: value creation, value innovation, and value protection. A president is supposed to hold the position of value protection, Charles. Now, it turns out holding the position of Minister of Petroleum and the president as a president means that you are dealing with value creation, value innovation, and at the same time value protection. And it is antithetical because it cannot work that way. From a risk management mitigation perspective, the president now, having confirmed as an executive president, even with due respect to the principles of separation of powers, as it is obtained in Nigeria, one of the most powerful executive presidents in the world, has further, made him a more of a one key man risk in Nigeria. So if you look at it, that is also the reason why the NNPC GMD is all powerful. The National Assembly cannot rein him in. And then, like His Highness said, who is going to audit? How do you audit your president? We have the Auditor General, we have the Accountant General, and whatever, the Statistician General. Nobody can hold the president to account within this context. From a performance perspective, Mr. President says, in this context, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu says he wants to run a performance-driven government. Who is going to evaluate or assess the performance of the petroleum portfolio? We all know that the Minister of State is neither here nor there with regard to his JD and KPI. So to be honest, holding the role of by the president's predecessors to be President Bola Ahmed Tinubu and him is going to continue sliding us into the backwards of abyss of darkness in terms of running the NNPC and the revenues we are claiming we are looking for. Charles, Mr. President, and everybody knows where the revenues are. So it is a question of, are we serious as a country to deal with the issue we are facing with of revenue, of leakages or wastages, or do we want to continue using excuses and creating a vehicle that will continue to take us into the abyss? Because if Mr. President removed subsidy for all the right reasons and we supported him, we expect also Mr. President to disrupt this very unproductive and very wrong position of holding the Minister of Petroleum going forward.
Very good point. And let me come to you, Dr. Constance Ikokwu. I mean, why do you reckon they all want to hold on to the portfolio of Petroleum Minister?
Well, when you look critically at Nigeria, it would seem that most of our practices were borrowed from the military regimes. We had military rule for more than 20 years in this country. So it was, command, central command. The so-called military president says something, nobody can counter him, and that's what it is. So we now have a so-called democratic government or democratic system, and it is not democratic in the real sense of the word. So we need to begin to rethink this so-called democratic system that we are practicing. There's a lot of things that we need to unpack. And I think part of the thing that the citizens need to do is to be unafraid to question those that hold power. Because when you look at what they do, they're not really our leaders, they're just rulers. They're just people in positions of authority, in positions of power that misuse that power. And so look at what Alhaji Sanusi said. He talked about the president giving out licenses, oil licenses to questionable characters. It's one of the reasons why a president will want to keep that position, because then it's a largesse. You can give it to whoever you want, whoever he pleases. So it's not a system that wants to promote job creation or transparency. So we need to critically look at this and turn it around. I think that it's very easy to do that, but the question is, are those in authority willing and interested in doing the right thing at the right time? Yes, we are here where they're talking about lack of revenue. Nigeria is a potentially rich country. We have no business talking about poverty in this country. Absolutely no business. And I want to also say, apart from the federal government, we're talking about oil now, apart from the federal government, we also need to move down to the states. When you get to the state level, when these monies are shared, there's also a lot of abuse, financial abuse that goes on at the state level. And so we begin to say, how do we begin to ask the governors too, not only the president, what are you doing with the funds that you receive monthly from Abuja? There has to be a shakedown in the country. If not, you cannot keep borrowing endlessly, which is going to take us nowhere.
Absolutely, key points there. You're watching Arise Prime Time. Plenty more still ahead. We'll continue our chat with our panel of analysts who are with me for the rest of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back to Arise Prime Time, where we offer perspectives on the news and talking points of the day. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Now, if there's one man who can ruffle official feathers in Nigeria, it's the controversial former governor of the central bank, Muhammadu Sanusi II, who's also the former emir of Kano. And once again, he's provoked enormous debate over what he says should be looked at critically and immediately, which is the opacity of the state oil company, the NNPC. He said that Nigeria needs to shine a bright light in the areas of revenue generation and oil production, and that this country cannot afford to continue to produce oil and not receive revenue in return. We're no longer paying subsidies, so where are the dollars, he asked. And then he laid into President Tinubu for retaining the portfolio of petroleum minister, saying that the president's occupation of that office made it difficult for questions of accountability to be raised. Mr. Sanusi also called for a proper audit of the NNPC in order to unravel Nigeria's daily oil production and the country's export and accrued revenue. In its response, the NNPC said there's no need for an official response because everyone is entitled to their opinion, and that the company is focused on delivering on the task that had been set for it, which is energy security, managing ongoing projects and implementing reforms. And our crop of top-level commentators are still with me, giving us their assessments. They are the current affairs analyst and professor of communications at Baze University in Abuja, Professor Abiodun Adeniyi, who's in our off-site studio, the journalist, political affairs commentator, and Arise News analyst, Dr. Constance Ikokwu, who's with me here in the main studio, and of course, the policy strategist, political commentator, and group CEO of the global investment and trade company, Yusuf, who's also here in the main studio. Thank you for staying with us. Let me come to you, Prof. Is there now a history of the NNPC being audited? Because I understand they now do it under Mele Kyari, who heads it, but obviously one's not quite sure how forensic that audit is. There's no sound coming from Prof. We can't hear what he's saying. But let me throw that question to you then, Baba Yusuf, because as I asked Prof, there seems to be a history now of the NNPC, I think since 2020 or so, starting to publish audited accounts. But the question is, how forensic is it?
Yes, that's true, especially with the PIB Act passed. Part of the governance framework is as a company that is private, quasi-private, should publish the audited accounts. But then the integrity of the reportage is questionable because of what we have been talking about. The fact that the president still holds reign of the ministry, and of course the what I call quote-unquote toothless bulldog situation of our National Assembly, even though they have been empowered by the Section 88 and 89 of the 1999 Constitution. It turns out that the various public hearings and all those investigations have not been able to make any impact per se to drive an audit that will be credible, that will be acceptable by Nigerians. So it turns out, ironically, even though they publish the audited accounts, people are taking it with a pinch of salt. And that is the level of mistrust, of the NNPC. Because if the process is opaque in nature, the transactions are opaque in nature, then your guess is as good as mine as to, personally, if I look at the books, how I will be able to justify or to relate with it and give it that credibility to myself or sell it to another entity that is serious.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Dr. Constance Ikokwu also talked about the banking sector, didn't he? I mean, Baba Yusuf was talking about the issue of trust there. I mean, he talked about the banking sector and why it was quintessentially important for bankers to shore up the trust of Nigerians. What do you make of that?
I mean, it's a critical point that he raised there. I remember under, again, President Olusegun's Obasanjo's administration, there was a lot of reforms that cleaned up the banking sector. Before that, you know, there were so many banks. You have your money, you know, the next month they tell you this bank has gone under, your money disappears, and nothing happens, and that's the end of the story. And so I think what we've progressed from those days to, you know, better days, but now we also have multiple banks. I think there are more banks than, you know, the last reforms that were done. So the most important thing, like he said, is that you want to have a situation where people have confidence, because it's not only good for us locally, it's also good for us internationally. You know, the world is a global village today. You have local financial transactions. You also have international ones. We travel a lot, so if you want to bank here, you also want to bank abroad. So you have a system that, you know, it's difficult to understand, a system that is complex, a system that nobody trusts, then it becomes a problem for your country. And that is why when you go abroad, a lot of people don't want to do financial transactions with Nigeria, online especially, because there are questions about, am I going to be swindled? Am I going to be scammed? So you want to do deep work, deep reforms to make sure that you tell the world that, hey, we're open for business, we're doing well, we have stringent regulations, and the regulators are not compromised. The regulators actually do their jobs. There is compliance, you know, and so when you have your books open like that, it helps the country, it helps with investment, it helps with job creation, it helps with so many different things. That's how you build an economy. That's how you build a country. Every single thing is connected. It's like a circle. It's connected. So when you break one from one point, it breaks the other point. Right. So very valid points that he has raised.
Okay, let me come back to you, Prof. I understand we've got your audio back. I apologize that we lost you there for a hot second. But we're now done with that audit question. So I'm going to move on to something else, and as briefly as you can, because we want to move on to the other topic that we want to discuss here. Another point that Mr. Sanusi raised was the controversial attempt to amend the Central Bank Act. He said it was fine as it is, and that any attempt to amend it would give the politicians the opportunity to meddle further into the CBN's affairs, and that would of course be unacceptable. Your take on that?
Well, to the extent that the Emir is concerned about politicization of the Act, I agree with him. But we also have to realize that, you know, acts are not always cast in stone. You know, acts are subject to amendments depending on the reality at hand. And of course, if the proposed amendment is coming because of that second reason, I think I will agree, you know, or I will acquiesce to the argument that it deserves or it needs some amendment. And do not forget, I don't assume that acts of amendment, you know, will only be the responsibility of the agency alone. It will go through due diligence, due process, probably the National Assembly, and probably needing presidential accent as well. So it's not something that will be solely the responsibility of the agency. Realities change, and of course, there have been, shifts in our experiences over the years with respect to monetary policy administration, which the bank is essentially responsible for. So if it is coming, or if it is being proposed because of the need to make it much more contemporary in view of changing realities, in view of the need to enhance the performance of the CBN, I think it's appropriate. And it's only on that ground that I will be different from the Emir, but of course we do not need acts to be politicized, you know, because once things are politicized, it deviates from the path of merit, you know, deflating into favoritism and such other things, apart from quality and, of course, good governance, as the case could be.
Reasonably brief, and we've got about 10 minutes or less left actually for this next bit, so we'll try and keep it all fairly tight. Let's look at another oil-related development now. The Dangote refinery has received its first cargo of crude oil. It's purchased 1 million barrels from Shell, and that has reportedly been discharged into the Dangote refinery oil tanks. So that's the beginning of the process of boosting Nigeria's domestic refining capacity, and presumably, Baba Yusuf, you welcome that development.
Yes, we are all excited with this milestone that I call it that has been achieved. Total cargo tonnage of about 6 million barrels coming in. We've had 1 million tranche coming in. We are going to see what is called a dry run of 350, barrels per day to run what you call the test instance, to, run the refinery to be active for us to go into the real instance where they will start producing for the market. So it's a welcome development. I congratulate Aliko Dangote for this feat. I congratulate Nigerians for this feat. And I encourage, I'm happy, I give kudos to the level of information dissemination with regards to this project, because everybody is interested in it. We'd like to see more, especially because Nigerians' monies have also been pumped into that as an investment, Charles. So the more, the merrier in terms of communication. And we expect now for us to have what I call the timelines for the milestones, so that Nigerians will expect when the products will hit the market, and that is very key. We understand that the first three products to be out is diesel, aviation fuel, and LPG, and then further down the line, the PMS will come into play. So It's a welcome development. We wait to see the outcomes in the next quarter.
Right, okay. Dr. Ikokwu, how significant is that development? Because it seems like the refinery, as Baba Yusuf was saying there, is now on the verge of becoming operational.
It is significant, 650,000 barrels per day capacity refinery. It is the 7th largest refinery in the whole world, and it's specifically designed for Nigerian crude. You have to admire the audacity of Mr. Aliko Dangote. You have to admire his tenacity and his boldness, yes, and the vision to take on this kind of gigantic project. And it was first announced in 2013. It took at least 10 years. Here we are now. A lot of people thought it would never happen, or it will hardly see the light of day, but here we are now. One thing to say is that it shows you that private sector vision and dream is possible, and the government should encourage more private sector in the area of manufacturing. It is true that he gets a lot of support from government. Every government that is in power, he gets favored. So you do not want to have a system that is a monopoly. You want to support as many people as possible, so that you have competition. Competition in a large economy drives down prices, and that's what you want to see. So it's good it has happened, and we wish him the best. Most of that money that we use to import petroleum products, at least we can keep it, in our pockets. Again, private sector efficiency. If it was government, this would probably be a lot of stories. So we'll see what goes on from here.
Yes, and Prof, sitting alone and marooned in our off-site studio, the key thing. The key thing is, of course, whether this will lead, as Dr. Ikokwu was saying there, whether this will lead to a significant reduction in imports of petroleum products, and there won't be any stories along the way.
Yeah, yes, Charles. We've had arguments severally that the price of PMS is often determined by the forces of demand and supply. And from my experience in the past, the price has always gone up, because demand is not equal to supply. So if we're not having a private sector company being very responsive in terms of helping us to show up the supply level, we can only hope that in the end it will have a rub-off effect on the price of PMS, and probably ease the pain, of the user at the end of the day. And of course, do not forget that we are probably having to cope with the situation where we have our 3 refineries, publicly owned refineries are down, Port Harcourt, Warri, and of course Kaduna, and we have to ship crude out for refining before they are brought in. This also has a way of putting pressure, on scarce foreign exchange. So if we are having supply coming locally, we can only invest our hope, in the future that, we could be able to achieve some mileage in terms of, regulating the price of PMS such that it will become a little more affordable and, of course, take us away from the present pain that we are presently feeling as a people.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Baba Yusuf, in terms of revenues, what's it going to mean for Nigeria? I mean, it's supposed to save a lot of foreign exchange, isn't it?
Yes, it should. We would like to see how that template works out in reality, Charles, because it's a more private sector front-facing, and I reckon in the first few years, in terms of revenue, we may not see much inflow from Dangote, but the savings that will be achieved from the flow going into Dangote to refine the crude for us. But again, what will be very key to that, the critical success factor, is the removal of opaqueness from the supplier of the crude to Dangote. Dangote's efficiency in refining the product will not be the key savings. That will give us more efficiency and on the supply side also. But in terms of getting more revenue and savings, the transparency and accountability of the NNPC will be what will be the second leg that will add value to Dangote activating the refinery in the mid to long term. And I want I want the government to tell Nigerians in clear terms for them to manage their expectations. When are we going to get the PMS so that we can envisage the tapering down and the flattening of the pricing in line with the global realities? We don't expect it to plunge, but we want to have a flattening depending on what the government is doing in line with transparency.
Right. And a final word from you, Dr. Ikokwu. As Baba Yusuf was saying there, really it's about when the petrol is going to be coming out and you go and put it, and it's from Dangote's refinery, in your car, and then you drive. But obviously it'll take a while for the crude to be processed and distributed.
Well, yes. The thing is, we have this refinery now. There will be obstacles, hurdles here and there. But again, it is private sector, so we're hoping that things will work out, as it should. He runs a business already, Again, finally, we need to encourage more people, more Dangotes in the country, because we're a large population and also growing. So we need a lot of people to get into manufacturing all sorts that we need in the country. That way, you don't have all your young ones doing japa, all across the world.
And on that hopeful, bucolic note, I want to thank all of you very much indeed. Dr. Constance Ikokwu, who is a journalist, political affairs commentator and Arise News analyst, the policy strategist, political commentator and group CEO of the global investment and trade company, Baba Yusuf, and of course in our off-site studio, the current affairs analyst and professor of communications at Baze University in Abuja, Professor Abiodun Adeniyi. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Join us again next week. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye and thank you for watching.